The Athletic.
We explain why Red Bull's car doesn't work over curbs and bumps, ask if F1's addiction to rule changes is healthy, and answer your questions on data gathering, aero regulations, hearing protection, and much more. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show. I'm Edd Straw and I'm joined as always by the star of the show, Gary Anderson, for more tech chat ahead of the Canadian Grand Prix. So Gary, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, yes. Canadian Grand Prix is always, it's an interesting race. We've always done quite well there. I mean, we had I think it was 95. We ended up with Jordan second and third to Jean Alesi. So it was Peugeot's best race result, to be honest, Formula One race result. And their PR guy, who's unfortunately passed away now, after the race, he rushed up and kissed me right on the smackers, you know. It's one of those things that you don't really need because he smokes these huge cigars. But anyway, they were so excited about that. And obviously we were as well because, there were points at that point in time was 10 for a win, 6 for second, 4 for third. And, to score 10 points at a Grand Prix, which we did by finishing second and third, was pretty impressive. So, yeah, I've always liked Canada.
Yeah, nice for the Peugeot engine at that time to hang together for a whole race distance. But also, Canada's a good place for Jordan in terms of the raft race, isn't it? That was famously Jordan territory for many years.
Yeah, it was really. I think, to be honest, it was the Jordan raft race. I think that's why it sort of ended, really, because we had won it for so many years. But interesting thing was the first year, 1991, we arrived in Phoenix for the first race of the year, and we didn't have a pit stand. We didn't actually know that people had pit stands. So I got a friend of mine who lived out there, who I had known when I was in America, and he came around and he made a pit stand for us out of like 2-inch aluminium scaffolding pipe. And we used that during the year because it was made very, very well. And we got to Canada and discovered this raft race. So we reassembled pit stand as it was all clamped together with scaffolding clamps, reassembled it in a bit of a different shape, put some parts trays in the bottom of it, found some old corner signs, polystyrene corner signs for ballast and or for flotation, and off we went and won the race. So, to be honest, that same pit stand got used for 3 years. But it was a good time then. The boat race was good. You had to go across the other side of the river and pick something out of the hedge. There was usually a bow tied in it, and your colour was like yellow or whatever. Pick that out and bring it back again. Then it got more and more involved. People were even Real, I think it was, used their spare chassis as their boat. But it wasn't very good. It sunk. So, it was fun.
That's a good one, isn't it? Yes. I think people using spare chassis for boats it's a long gone part of Formula 1. That's something that's been lost, I think. But anyway, well, as usual, we'll start with a free choice of topic. I think that's probably a fairly obvious one for you to tackle, even though we're a week out from the Monaco Grand Prix, given what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those sort of things that it's had a lot of chat about it, and Red Bull's problem in Monaco on riding the curbs and basically riding uneven ground, I suppose you might call it, was less than acceptable. Yeah. Now, first of all, you got to take into account that the season is 24 races. It's not just Monaco. It's one of those sort of situations where if Monaco was bumpy, but I watched the Detroit IndyCar race, and that Monaco's got nothing on that. So let's be real here. Monaco is a bumpy Formula One circuit, but the reality of it is, you want that stiffness, that stability, lateral stability, really, when you're pulling, 4.5 G laterally around, the Beckett's complex at Silverstone, or the S's in Suzuka through that fast section in Austin. Those are the times when you need that. You have to have that, and you got to balance all that up against, one or maybe 2 races where you'll suffer a little bit with climbing curbs or camber changes on the road. So it's a balancing act. As I keep saying in my articles, it's everything's a compromise, and you balance up where the amount of good it gives you relative to the amount of bad it gives you. Now, saying all of that, yeah, the balance is still in Red Bull's favour, I think, as far as the out-and-out performance of the car is concerned. But they are, the others, Ferrari and McLaren, are starting to nip at their heels, and that bodes well for the future, because obviously if you've got a half a second gap to the next car coming along, you can afford to do your own thing, just keep your head down. Whereas if it becomes a 0.2 or a tenth, then suddenly you have to take into account what everybody else is doing, and you have to react to it. So I think we are going to see, even at the faster circuits where the Red Bull will still be probably fairly dominant, we will see the competition being closer. And that bodes well for Formula One. We want competition. We don't want to know who's going to win the race before it even starts. You want to see it change a little bit. There's lots of other things that need to happen before I think we'll see McLaren and Ferrari being a consistent winner. But I do believe that the problems in Monaco are not a one-off by any means. There will be other circuits where it will be near the mark. And that's just because, the gap that Red Bull have created this year is, or have this year, is not as big as it was in the past. So instead of just the others being closer, they now overcome them. So, it'll be nice to see how the season unfolds. And it'll also be nice to see how Red Bull react, because I'm sure they're not going to stand still by any means. But they have got, you have got whatever you like to call it, internal turmoil, which is, with Adrian moving on, I'm not sure how they work all that, because they say that Adrian's not really in the engineering meetings anymore. So now they've got to stand up and be counted without Adrian Newey, I suppose you might call it. And we'll see how they react to that. And that will be interesting.
Yeah, it's always a slow process, that, isn't it? You have a slow burn in terms of any internal team problems. So that one will play out. The interesting question is, with these regulations, they're quite three-dimensional, aren't they? The challenge in terms of what limitation you hit. Is it possible that with these regs, as teams understand them, you're always going to have to place yourself kind of somewhere on that spectrum, in that you can't necessarily have a car that's as good as the Red Bull on, say, a typical conventional circuit without giving away a few more of the outliers, and there's no kind of magic compromise that's going to be brilliant everywhere, unless you've got such a huge advantage that a 7/10 advantage on a good day becomes a 3/10 advantage on a bad day, which was kind of the world of last year. Is this just a reality of the rules, or do you think that there is enough of a gain that Red Bull can make by fixing this? Because you don't fix anything in isolation, do you? Will they give away too much if they eliminate this problem, or is it something that should be tackled?
I think you have to focus on the big picture, as I say, the 24 races as opposed to one. It's always difficult to say. You should be able to have a car that is compliant on the bumps and the curbs and is stable in the fast corners as well. But it's very, very difficult to achieve that. And the thing you don't want to be doing is having a different car every time it turns up at a race meeting. You're better to have the same car and understand your limitations at some of them and accept your limitations than being tricked and having something completely different for places like Monaco or whoever, Singapore or Hungary, whatever. It's one of those sort of situations, as I say, you get the best out of something even though it's not quite as good as what you'd like it to be sometimes, because the competition's getting tougher. So it'll be interesting to see, because Ferrari have been good at Monaco for quite a while, quite a few years, to be honest, and they've obviously got a car that's pretty compliant, and obviously Leclerc is a top line driver, as is Max Verstappen. So if you give them a car that can do the job, they bring you back the end results. But the McLaren, for me, is the interesting one. It's shown over the last 2 years that you can come from somewhere that's pretty dismal to somewhere that's pretty good. If you go back to Jordan in '98, it's a very similar sort of thing, really. Before their success arrived, I had moved on. But still, I have to give the team a pat on the back, and I would include myself a little bit in that, because we had plans in place before I did move on, to come from a team that was in a pretty dismal place not knowingly have done something wrong to actually winning a race, finishing first and second in Spa. Yeah, conditions unloaded, and it meant they were first and second, but relatively they were competitive at the last part of that season. So you can do it. It's just a matter of, I always say, recognising the problem and fixing the problem. And in 98 with Jordan, that's what we did. It took a while to recognise the problem because it was in the reshirts area that was something that we didn't normally do. And for McLaren, at the beginning of last year, it was the same sort of deal. They had a plan, and they absorbed their lack of success, I suppose you might call it, with their heads held high, knowing that they were on top of it, recognising the problem, and that they were heading in the right direction to get to rectify it. So that's important. So, as I say, McLaren are more impressive to me at the minute than Ferrari in its own little way. But the competition between the three top teams now, Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren, is pretty tough. So a blink of an eyelid and it could be anybody sitting on pole. And again, the same blink of an eyelid and one of the drivers from those top three teams could win the race. So I think the competition's there. The only problem is it's three teams. It's not 5 or 6 teams, which is what we'd really like. But 3 teams is better than 1.
Yeah, that's what we're all hoping for. Although I guess from Red Bull's perspective, if Monaco was the worst case scenario, that's what Max Verstappen called it. They still had a car that he should really have qualified third, maybe even second. So he'd have been on the podium and he'd have been in that train at the front. So it's hardly a disaster. But yeah, something for Red Bull to keep an eye on. Let's move on to our main topic now, which is about regulations. And F1's very close to finalising the chassis regulations for 2026. They've been worked on for a very, very long time. The power unit regs have been publicly available for quite a while now. But I really wanted to talk about the big picture because we've got this continuous cycle of major regulation overhauls every 4 years. They seem to be at the moment. They have been spaced apart by 5 years. That seems to be the way of things now in Formula 1. Do you think that's the right approach philosophically, to have a world where, every 4 years we'll have some kind of major rules overhaul?
No, I don't actually. I think you'd be far better, let's say, dotting the I's and crossing the T's as the season unfolds, or as the seasons unfold. So you start at the beginning of a year, you give yourself up to, I don't know, race 5, 4, 6, whatever, to recognise the problem with problems with the regulations, and then you identify solutions for the year after. We've got ourselves in a situation now where the teams are enormous, a huge amount of manpower, and you end up with, really and truthfully, the second half of the current season is when you're starting to dedicate people to the design of your car for the following year. So as long as the regulations are put into place by mid-season of any changes, and I'll come to a couple of examples of that in a minute, you would end up with more of a situation of reaction to the problems that you have, as opposed to rewriting the rules for 4 years' time and making the same set of problems. Because that's what always happens. If you blindly go into it, you just end up with the same sort of problems, the same sort of problem set. We have got lots of things that need to be done for the big picture, and they could be in place over the 4-year cycle. For example, the wheelbase of the cars at the minute, it's 3.6 metres maximum. Most people are there. We're sort of talking about the cars being too big. So I'm a big believer in this sort of 10% or 5%, go a percentage thing across everything. Make the cars 10% shorter, make them 10% narrower. Just try to help overtaking by making the cars not so big, so you can plug it into a smaller space and it might fit. At the moment, the cars are so big that you can't. So no, I think there's a big picture change that needs to be done every so many years, but there's small picture changes on the way that should be done every year. And one of them for me is, for example, we have the front wing end plates. You've got the leading edge, the external edge of it has to be 5mm radius to stop people cutting tyres. Now, we saw at the start of the race in Monaco when Sainz ran into the side of Piastri at the first corner and cut his left front tyre. we have all that furniture down the side of the floor, all razor sharp edges. And, if you touch the sidewall of a tyre, the sidewall of the tyre is the weakest component. Touch the sidewall of the tyre, one of those little turning vanes down the side of the floor, you end up with losing a car immediately. And those are the things that I'm talking about reacting to, because of the front wing end plate rule of a radius, a 5mm radius, it means the end plate has to be 10mm thick. You could just immediately put that rule into the side of the floor, and it would be another new challenge for the teams because of the being used aerodynamically, but it would be better for the situation where you just cut tyres, that any external edge of the floor has to be an R5. So there's lots of little things you could do that will make the formula, I think, better and challenging each year, just to optimise it, but not by reinventing the wheel. You just have to sort of dot the I's and cross the T's on it. So, it's one of those situations. There's never a right, there's never a wrong. But I think every time we've seen the regulations change in a fairly dramatic way, it's ended up bringing with it another set of problems, and that will always be the same. And I think that should be looked at and reduced.
It's an interesting thing, the way the approach to regulations has changed over the years, hasn't it? I always think of it, for a long time, it was technology limited, wasn't it? In that rules were very basic. You go back far enough and it's basically a weight formula, and that's about it. But then it became more and more complicated. I've got, around the corner, I've got a yellow book from 1973, your first season, with the regs from that year for F1, which are pretty compact. Might have to get you to go through those at some stages. That's quite fun. But we've moved out of the technology and safety limited era into a thing where we're trying to turn F1 into what we want it to be, to solve problems, to make the product better, the show, and all this kind of thing. But you can argue, and people do argue, that actually stability is the best thing you can possibly do for the show, because you will get convergence. Do you think that convergence is an inviolable law, that if you have rule stability, that will happen?
Yes, I mean, we are seeing it, as I say, again, with Ferrari and McLaren. It's one of those situations, I think, right now, if you looked at the grid, let's say the average spread is it's 2 seconds. It's probably a little bit more than that on some occasions, but let's say 2 seconds roughly. So there's 20 cars in the grid, that's a tenth of a second between each car. That we're talking about a tenth of a second. That's, at the Olympics, that's a reaction time that anything less than that, and you're cheating. So it's not a very big amount of time, and you've got one of these situations where 15 years ago, whenever we all think it was great, maybe in the middle of the 2000s, you end up, or 2004, 2005, you'd end up with the car third or fourth in the grid was 2 seconds away from pole, and still they were doing a good job. So yes, the teams have closed the gap up dramatically. I mean, we still look and sort of make noises about the teams at the back not doing a very good job. But hey, let me tell you something: it's not easy. They are doing a good job, and we need to accept that convergence will happen. Now, it's happened for lots and lots of reasons, because the understanding, the manpower has got so strong, but all the simulation tools that every team has now, some are better than others, but all the simulation tools that every team has, the CFD understanding, wind tunnel research, the level of the wind tunnel models, all of that stuff has allowed the teams to close the gap, because it's gone are the days when you stick your finger in the air and design something just through pure gut feel. It's all about proving the numbers. Now that can lead you astray a little bit here and there, but the reality of it is it's still meant the teams have closed up. The gaps have closed up between the teams. And that'll always happen. No matter what the rule set will be, that'll happen. The initial thing will be they'll spread a little bit further to begin with, and then they'll close up again. So by changing the rules dramatically for every 4 years, all you do is make that spread, and then everybody fights back again. And then you'll change them again, and then you make that spread. So there's never a right and never a wrong, as I say. But I think that, we always will see convergence of some sort or another.
There also tends to be a problem with the approach to rule changes, in that there's always one overriding factor or objective that's being pursued. If you go back, right, 2009, it was all about making the cars easier to follow, the skinny aero. 2014, there were quite a few chassis changes as well, but it was primarily about the hybrid engines being introduced. 2017, high downforce, wide cars with a solution to all ills. And then 2022, ground effect was the way to make following easier. That was seen as the kind of solution. Then 26, really, it's about making the cars work for the approach they've taken with the power units in terms of the massive increase in the electrical power and trying to make it more 50-50 with the conventional engine. So you could always plot it with this one overriding thing. And that feels to me a dangerous thing to do, because the answer's never one thing, is it? There's always, it's always a kind of global solution. And that's kind of why when we have great seasons, you can never, you can explain the reasons for it, but it's never really one thing, because you also need the teams to do their job and extract the maximum from their potential. So it's almost this everlasting chasing of tails, isn't it? In terms of, right, this is the thing we need to do, or you force yourself into a corner, as they have done with the 26 rules on the power units.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because it's what the objective really is. We have, for quite a few of those rule changes, it was about overtaking, better racing. But, we have a formula that means the fastest cars on pole position. Take Monaco, for example. I think the top 10 cars on the grid finished top 10 in the same order. So we have a set of regulations that means the fastest car gets on the pole position. And Monaco's an example, is the worst example of all the tracks, I suppose you might call it. So as a procession, pole position, if the car keeps running and you don't make any mistakes, you'll win the race. And you can win the race at very slow speed, as we saw in Monaco this year. So you've got to make sure you set the objectives correct for the regulation changes. What do you want from a racing car? Do you want to see engineering excellence, where the front row is always the two cars from one team? Do you want to see driver excellence, where the front row is always one driver and it's there's big gaps to your second driver? Or do you want to see a sort of, banger racing where they're all passing each other 3 or 4 times every lap? So it depends on what you want to do get out of it. But the formula itself is laid down by the fastest car being the front of the grid, which means the fastest drivers at the front of the grid. And while it's like that, you'll always end up with the potential of a procession. And no matter what the regulations are, it still ends up with the same deal. There's ways and means of sharing, I suppose, more performance data between teams to try and help other teams. But at the end of the day, you've got to decide what your objective is as far as the regulation changes are concerned. And up to now, as I say, it's always been about trying to make better racing. But you're making better racing out of a bad thing, because the whole definition of it is the fastest cars at the front. So you've got to try and change the laws of gravity by saying this bloke who's 20th on the grid should still be able to win the race. Well, sorry, no. He's 20th on the grid for a reason. There will be exceptions here and there where a quick car ends up because of a problem, but the exceptions are very few and far between.
Yeah, there's certain things that cannot be achieved that have to be recognised and not part of it. And yeah, the whole point is you need to reward those who produce the good cars, don't you? That's the nature of the sport as well. But it is interesting, isn't it? And I guess this changed very much through your career in Formula One. These sort of periodic crises about the quality of the racing and that kind of thing. And it seemed to be kind of maybe in the 90s that started to creep in to be a more consistent thing, probably because of how much it had grown on television. And then we have all these sort of, you have these crisis point races, don't you, where the race is really dull and everyone gets really excited about it. Bahrain 2010 is probably the one that stands out most to me. Everyone was just panicking about F1 refueling a comeback, and it had been a dull race, but there have been all sorts of races like that. Spain 99 was another dull one. But I don't know how you see that the way things have evolved, and it is a little bit of a recurring panic almost, isn't it, that doesn't lend itself to good outcomes, even though I would say that the FIA has become much better, or vastly better, in terms of being research-based and science-based in its rules creation.
Yeah, it is research-based and science-based, but the big problem is really it's at the level it's at with, half a dozen people doing the research, whereas you suddenly hand out a set of regulations to 600 people doing the research, probably 100 at least at each team, minimum. So what chance do they really stand? That's the problem. It's one of those sort of situations where perhaps the team should have more input in the regulation changes and genuinely more input. And it's sort of done on you send in your solutions to the problem, and prioritise them, top 10. And then we'll average it out across the teams and see who's talking the same language, or if we think that any one team is just protecting itself, just working on its own interests rather than the global picture. Because you'll never ever compete against the level of the teams. And we can see that the teams can't compete against the level of each other. So the FIA, again, is, it's a small group that's doing this work. Relatively, it was a large group, back in the day, because there was still research done when Charlie Whiting was head of the technical side of FIA. They still did lots of research, but it was research, and they were fighting against teams that were consisting of 5, maybe 10 people, as opposed to 100 to 200 now that were looking for the solutions. So, we used to sit in the meetings that we were having in the FIA meetings that they called with the teams. A technical representative will go to each one, and you'd be sitting there listening to everything that people were suggesting, especially after Ayrton Senna's incident, whenever the group did get together to try and put changes afoot. But you'd be sitting there listening to what people were saying, and how the FIA were reacting, and you'd be trying to find solutions while you were sitting in that meeting, because if somebody suggested something and you thought you saw your way through it somehow and could live with it, you were the first to put your hand up and say, yeah, great idea, love it, yeah. So otherwise there was other people sitting there, and they were, everything was wrong. And one team was Ferrari, to be honest, sitting there, and when Ross Brawn got involved with the Ferrari situation later in the 90s, Ross would call home for everything. He would these ideas would come up, and he'd say, I'll have to call my guys back at base to see what they think. And that just shows you that they were bigger than we were. There weren't really any one-man bands then, but there were 3, 4, 5-man bands, and you should know everything that's going on without having to call home to see which way the wind's blowing. So it's an interesting time in the 90s, as you say, the mid-90s there, because it was the time that the teams started changing from being racing teams, I suppose you might call it, to then suddenly becoming a big business.
Yeah, and also I think what you say there sums up the fundamental problem that no matter what you try and do with the rules in terms of making the regulations, you've got a bunch of well-resourced teams all trying to break your intent. Ultimately, that's their job. So it's a never-ending circle. But it's it was worth having a bit of a chat about the bigger picture, because obviously we're expecting the new rules fairly shortly. Once they're published and out there, we'll doubtless go through them in great detail on this podcast. But that's a good scene setter for the rules change philosophy. Well, let's move on to some listener questions now. We always love questions on this podcast, and Gary's always been a great exponent of trying to explain Formula One to the fans, even when he was on the coalface as a technical director. If you'd like to send in a question, send it to podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. You can either send the questions in written, or you could even record a voice note if you like and send that to us and let us know who you are if you record an audio note. We've got a bunch of questions today, which is great. Always appreciate them. So let's dive into them. The first is from Adam McCluskey, who says, watching Monaco become a stop-free procession got me thinking about the red flag tyre rules. In other series, you can't touch the car under red, but in F1, they make repairs and change the tyres. I understand not wanting to force them out on tyres that are unsafe, so allowing them to change, but why wouldn't they amend the rule so that they need to be fitted with the same compound? Call it tyre park for me. I understand teams may not like that in having to fit old, already used tyres, or they may be out of set to that particular compound, but I can think of 2 red flags in recent memory where this rule would have improved the racing. king. And the first of those is this weekend in Monaco. I don't have any proof that it would make it better, but it couldn't have made it worse, forcing at least some level of strategy. And second, Hungary 21. Everyone went to the red flag with a wet tyre. Everyone left with a wet tyre. Then all but one decided to change before the standing start, causing one of the more chaotic races of a chaotic season. This would be the situation responding to the events of Monaco for those who didn't have a set of hards, for example. Well, lots there, Gary. What do you make of the tyre rule?
Well, Adam, I agree with you completely. I've been sort of saying this for years. I think you've got a situation where you've got to identify a little bit as to whether the damage to your car was caused because you were involved in the incident, or whether it was caused because of the incident. In other words, you ran over debris or whatever. So those are two sort of different scenarios. I agree with you 100% that whatever tyre you come in, a red flag situation, whatever tyre you come in on the pit lane, you have to leave with that same tyre, same compound, because you have to allow them to be changed, I believe, because of debris on the track, carbon fibre cutting tyres, so you can end up with a damaged tyre. But it's one of those sort of situations where identifying the damage that might have been done to the car through hitting bits of carbon fibre or bits of the incident as such, without actually being part of the incident, then it's a fine line between allowing that to be fixed. And there could be something, a little bit of a judgment made. Let's say if you were driving around before it with the front wing end plate missing, and the incident happened, the red flag came out, and suddenly you're in the pits and you can change your front wing, that could be stopped. But it does get a bit complicated. So I think in general, allowing car repairs is acceptable, because we want to see racing and want all the cars to be as good a spec as possible. But I do agree with you 100% that whatever you come into the pit lane with during the red flag, you have to leave with that same tyre compound. Now, you could say, okay, well, maybe the team wouldn't have one of those sets of tyres. Well, that's just organisation at the beginning of the weekend. It's quite simple. You have to keep a set of tyres for that situation. And to be honest, Pirelli log the laps that the tyres have done. There could be a set of tyres allocated at each point. There are similar life, all that sort of stuff. That's easy enough to do. There's no big drama there. But it definitely should be the same compound that you leave the pits with, so that you don't affect the strategy. And the sooner that's done, for me, the better. And I think we are seeing other people that maybe have more influence than us starting to talk about that, even the drivers. Because it is one of those sort of situations where we saw in Monaco, put on the hard tyre, go to the end, and as long as you look after your lap time and drive around 3 seconds off, what you could normally do, then you've got no dramas. But it does make a procession out of it, so that needs to change for sure.
Yeah, there's certainly some things that they'd need to do in terms of the tyre allocation, available tyres to tackle that. But like you say, everything's solvable in that regard. But obviously, it's just such a big problem now because we have so many red flags compared to what used to be the case. It used to be they were fairly rare and they tended to be biased towards the very start of the race. So although we had the same in Monaco, Monaco's an extreme case because it's the classic one-stopper and you can run to the end on a set of mediums, but often that doesn't create such a big offset. But yeah, it's certainly something worth looking at. The next question comes from Pegasus Serjan Ignatias, which I've definitely mispronounced, and I apologise for that. Hopefully I'll get the question well pronounced. I'd like to ask you guys about the electronics and data gathered in Formula One. What are they trying to find out with those sensors, and what are the most important data points they have to gather? Thanks for your time, and I really enjoy the show that you guys make.
Well, first of all, I'll just go for Pegasus here because I couldn't pronounce it either. First of all, there's lots of data gathered. There's many channels on the cars, and there is two sort of levels. One is reliability. So we'll talk here about the data would be the water temperature, oil pressures, both engine and gearbox, and hydraulics. Tyre pressures, tyre temperatures, brake wear, all of those things are gathered. The data is gathered, and some of it will be fairly high speed, some of it will be low speed. In other words, how many samples per second there is. Some of it you don't have to do too quickly. Some of it you have to do quickly to identify a problem. For example, oil pressure, engine oil pressure. You have to look at that pretty, high speed to detect potentially a problem. So they're all the reliability channels, I suppose you might call it. And then you go into the performance channels, which would have everything really that makes the car, everything that really the car does going around the track will be transmitted either into the black box and logged for later on, or it'll be sent real time to the pits and the team will analyse it. And then that you'll have suspension movement, suspension loads. You'll have aerodynamic pressure sensors in the underfloor, in the front wing, in the rear wing. So you'll be able to define, if everything's working as planned. In other words, you'll get a pressure trace across the floor of the car, which will, you can compare that lap to lap to lap, and you'll see if suddenly you think you've got a paper bag in it or whatever. So there's lots of different sensors. I believe the reliability sensors in my book should be allowed. I see no reason for them not to be, which consists of all the engine parameters, gearbox parameters, and from my point of view, the tyre pressures would be acceptable because they obviously have a puncture. Brake wear is a little bit of a thing. It's one of those sort of things you want to monitor it, but the brakes, now the technology behind the brakes is so much that you never really start a race and run out of brakes anymore. You used to, but it doesn't happen anymore. But from my point of view, the reliability would be important, but the performance sensors, I believe they should be logged quite happily, but not be able to be sent back in real time, so that basically the teams had to work a bit more in the dark as far as getting the best out of the car was concerned. Because what happens is the teams get all these sensors, all this data, and that goes straight back to base. They feed that into their simulator, or they have another group of 20 engineers analysing it to try and find that squiggly line that isn't squiggling in the right direction because of something. So they look at the detail in minute detail, look at all the data in minute detail, and they'll offer suggestions as to setup changes, roll stiffness or vertical stiffness or, whatever, damper settings, ride height, you name it. And that obviously just means that the better that the team uses the data, the better that team will be at moving forward during a given weekend. And as I say, if all that data, the performance data, was held until Sunday night, then you'd have to work a little bit more by sticking your finger up in there to see which way the wind's blowing. And that means, you're bringing on engineers as well. You're actually, the driver and the engineer will have a much more important part in it all. It's just reduces it down to the relationship between those two guys to come up with the best solution. Because there's many times I've seen where, the data says you should do this sort of lap time, and you can't, and it's a why. You've got to make the driver satisfied with what he's driving. So there's a lot to be done with the data, but just to sum up the question, there's just a huge amount of channels there, gathering lots and lots of comparable data to see how the car's working, if it's worth its working window. And that's really, I think, one of the things that they could change in F1 to make it a bit more weekend reliant on an engineer and a driver doing a good job.
The next question comes from Alex Stager, who says, while the possible points change might be good, does it still come back to the fact the aero regulations for F1 are way too stringent for the majority in F1 to compete? Said differently, do the top teams still find a way to make the regs work because of the depth of workforce, i.e. people want to work for top organisations and will take less pay to build their resume, while the midfield and lower teams hope their top people figure it out before the others? The cost cap seems like it might even out expenses, but it seems like it doesn't make up for intelligence and intuition when digging into the depths of the larger, more established teams.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger, more established teams are more powerful. I wouldn't actually jump in there and say that the less pay bit, I don't think that really happens, I think the teams all want the best people, and if you got the best people, you will pay more for it. It's up to the individual person to get their foot in the door somehow. If you can get your foot in the door with a team, then you might do it at a reduced pay to show your worth. And once you start to show your worth, then you can move forward with it. But we have got a situation at the moment where the big teams, the teams that are winning, and I say winning now as opposed to the team that is winning, the teams that are winning right now, and the next two or three behind them are are bigger than the rest, just because of the fact they can pull in more money. So success brings you in more money. Success means that other people would like to go and work with you. But mainly the success brings in more money so you can afford more people. And the budget cap was supposed to sort of contain that to a certain level and contain the amount of componentry that you made from your research and development. And make sure you would have to make sure that what you did do ended up on the car and was positive. We've seen through the years so many times, Toyota were an example. They just spent money, and many parts of their development program would just end up in a skip out the back of the paddock because it just didn't work. And they had to sort of stop that somehow. So the budget cap has a little bit of control over that. But I think there's room for improvement there. But I don't see any way that you won't have a better finance team that's able to hire more people, more good people, being at the top of the ladder, because that's what it's all about. Any business, I think, is successful because of the exact same thing.
Next up, we've got a question from Miles, who says, the difference in size between the front and rear tyres in terms of width, aspect and diameter has changed quite a bit over the various eras in F1. How do differences between front and rear tyre size affect car balance, aerodynamics and overall characteristics? Why don't they make the front and rear tyres the same size? How are these decisions made?
They have changed dramatically over the years as aerodynamics become more and more powerful, I suppose you might call it. You have situations where, if you go way back to my days in the 70s, the front tire just didn't look adequate. And yet you would see the cars coming through a corner with a nice sort of drift on, these huge rear tires, but still the car would always have a little bit of a drift, i.e. a Ronnie Peterson special. So, those days are gone. Going into how do they make the tires, the situation with the size of the tires, the car sort of follows the path of the tire, and the tire sort of follows the path of the car. The weight distribution of the cars, let's say, is roughly 42% front, 58% rear, something like that. And the aerodynamic distribution is not very much different from that. So the reality of it is that you want a similar sort of tire. Tire size, because that black bit of rubber on the track is what you have to contain the car going around a corner, or to support the car going around a corner. The big thing is under braking, and you'll see quite often, 58% on the driver's steering wheel of brake percentage front, and that's, as I say, that then means that you're stopping 58% of the car weight with the front brakes. And that gives you, 42% on the rear. So those things are all accountable. The front tyre does more stopping. The rear tyre does more accelerating. So the front tyre has more shock temperature going into it because of the braking. You're braking from 350 k's down to 100 k's in about a second, whereas the rear tyre has a less shock input but more constant load accelerating the car. So it's all a compromise of all that stuff, what the car is doing. But mid-corner, in a very fast corner, let's say 250, 300 kilometre corner, you've just got the lateral force of the car, which, as I say, is 40+% front and just under 60% rear, trying to spit the car into the hedge, and the tyre has to react that. And the aerodynamics is the adjustable load you can put onto there. If the front car's understeering a little bit in the fast corner, you can put a little bit more downforce on the front, which will give you a little bit more vertical force, but it doesn't change the lateral force. And vice versa. If the car's oversteering a little bit, you can either take off a little bit of front wing or put on a little bit of rear wing. And basically the lateral force doesn't change because that's the weight of the car, but the vertical force alters, the vertical centre of pressure alters. So it's the cart and the horse. You've got the tyres you've got. You design and build your car around that tyre contact patch and what it has to do. And then that'll evolve for next year because everybody's struggling, let's say, with the front tyres. And you'll find that Pirelli will maybe make a wider, bigger, whatever you call it, front tyre, just because of needing more contact patch. But it's the cart and the horse. Neither of them came first. I don't know which one will be the last one either.
The next question comes from Just Fuss, who says, I'm curious about an element of rarely discussed safety equipment, hearing protection. I recently attended my first live motor race, an IndyCar event here in the States, and was amazed how loud it was, even with hearing protection in the grandstands. As I understand it, IndyCars are quieter than modern F1 cars, which are themselves famously much quieter than they used to be. I'm curious what F1 teams do to protect their drivers and trackside staff from the hearing damage. What is the state of modern hearing protection? How has it evolved over the past decades of the sport? And how is anyone who worked trackside during the V10 era not completely deaf now? It's definitely fair to say people have been around motorsport a lot. Certainly feel it in the ears, don't they?
Sorry, Ed, can you say that again?
Definitely those who've been around motorsport for quite a while, they feel it in their hearing, don't they?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been around for quite a while. I've been through, I suppose, quite a few of the eras from the 70s with the old V8 Cosworth. I mean, you could wake up in the morning to the difference and understand the difference on the car that was warming up in the pit lane from the Ferrari Flat 12 to the V8 Cosworth. You would know which car it was. It's one of the things, yes. The worst era, I suppose, was the very high RPM V10s, 20,000 RPM now and again. The frequency of that was just what killed you. So, you had to wear some type of earmuffs. And as we saw as the years gone past, the whole team really wears some type of radio communication earmuffs now. So they are developed and they are improved all the time. But Formula One now is massively different from in the 2000s, the early 2000s, when we had the high revving engines. That was the time whenever it really did hurt whenever you heard a car go past and you weren't prepared for it. During the current cycle from 2014 with the hybrid engine, and having the turbocharger, because the turbocharger acts as a bit of a silencer. It just, contains the exhaust gases. There was a time whenever we complained a lot about the noise level. I think the noise level now is quite practical. It's not stupid. You really wouldn't really hurt your ears not having headphones on. So it has got better. The formula has changed so much. But going back to, as I say, that very high revving RPM, the V10s, that was a time whenever it hurt your ears whenever something went past. I remember standing in the garage with the Peugeot guys one night. We were starting up the engine after having an engine change done, and it revved to 14,000 at the time from memory, something like that region. But they'd set the throttle potentiometer, the fly-by-wire throttle the wrong way round. So as it fired, it just went flat out to 14,000 RPM. And you're standing beside this thing. And, everybody ran. It was so noisy. I'm probably a bit stupid. I didn't run. I just reached over and pressed the stop button so that it stopped, switched it off, basically. But it was one of those sort of situations where it went from 0 RPM to 14,000 in, milliseconds. And it was quite interesting because that had never happened before. So Peugeot did look at that, the acceleration rate of the engine. And then they started to actually do that as a comparison to some of their developments, because obviously the free acceleration rate of the engine is quite important to friction, and it sort of helped them. It helped them in a direction of development, because if the engine can respond, then it's quite important. So it happened by accident, but then they spent a lot of time doing it, so researching it. So yeah, noise level in Formula One's changed a lot. The earmuffs have got better, but it's one of those sort of things. You're in a harsh environment, so you should protect yourself. It's more the public I worry about, and people taking kids into the grandstand. You've got to really be careful there, because we're all consenting adults, I suppose you might call it. So we wouldn't be there if we didn't actually accept it.
No, I think that's certainly true, and it's I mean, in the question, isn't it, a surprise of how loud things can be, and even modest racing cars, a field of those can be extremely loud. The final question comes from Alua Damilola Gerald Labiran, who says, my questions have to do with the aerodynamic testing regulations that were brought into F1. At the beginning of these set of regulations, there were far more discussions about the potential these regulations had to keep the competition between the top cars close. Quite a lot of noise was made on the possible effects of Red Bull's cost cap breach punishment on their competitiveness, but as time has passed, I've heard less and less of these restrictions being mentioned, especially on the race. At the beginning of the season, everyone at the race firmly believed that Red Bull would go on to dominate the rest of the season and the next season. Of course, that's changed since McLaren and Ferrari made steps forward. So has the ATR been effective in any way? Does the scale need to be more punishing for the top teams? Does the FIA and F1 still regulate this? Or was this all an exercise in futility? Well, it's certainly still there, isn't it? And certainly still regulated, but it's sort of become part of the landscape now, isn't it? So I guess that's one of the reasons why it's talked about less.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of situations where, the cost cap is one of those is there and to control the amount of stuff you make, and the manpower you have and the equipment you have and just the expenditure. I don't agree with it because I think it should be every team's complete expense, including the top three earners and the driver and all of that stuff. It should be exactly what you send to for your accounts, really, because that's what you spend, and that should be the controlling factor. It'd be a huge number, but it better to be a huge number encompassing everything. But going to the aerodynamic testing regulations, the ATR as we call it, I think that needs to be revised, and the difference between top teams and the back teams revised, the percentage, in a way that basically you try and control the amount of manpower you have, because the winning teams will always be able to apply more logic to things. The winning teams have got stronger people, better people, more experienced people, whatever you like to call it. So you end up with a situation where we have a rule. It doesn't achieve anything. We talked about regulations and car regulations, but we have a rule in there. We have a control strategy to mean that the top guys don't get as much wind tunnel time as the guys at the back. And obviously, those percentages aren't correct. They need to be changed. And if they were changed, then we might see the grid come closer together. And it wouldn't be artificial. It would just be equalising, because at the end of the day, the teams that aren't doing so well for a reason. So, you've answered your own question, I think, in the same way. They just need the situation's there, the regulation exists. It just needs the numbers altered a bit. The big teams will fight that, but that's so be it. That's life. That's what I'm saying about looking at the bigger picture, the acceptance of it, just looking at the bigger picture, and perhaps a better solution. And the aerodynamic testing regulations probably offer the biggest solution to any regulation that's that's written at the moment that would actually help the teams close up a bit more.
Yeah, and there's certainly those in the F1 paddock who are lobbying for a slight change in the shaping, as they call it, of the ATR curve. The only thing I would say is that things like the ATR and the cost cap, collectively, they're always going to be a very long-term force, should we say. They were never a quick fix. So I'd argue we're still in the phase where this is all playing out, but that was always going to be a very long-term thing, and obviously you want to see shorter-term effects as well. So, yeah, it's a tricky thing, something like the ATR, because you don't want to make it impossible for a team that's doing well to continue to do well, but you also want it to be effective enough to kind of keep the field condensed. So it's a tricky old thing to master, but there's always value in looking at the way it's done and the way it's implemented. And now they do have at least a decent number of years of data to learn a little bit from. Well, thanks very much to everyone for your questions, and thanks to Gary for your answers. Do send your questions through to podcasts@therace.com. We always try and get through as many of them as we can, and we massively appreciate the range of questions we get as well from all over the world. Well, we're turning our attention to the Canadian Grand Prix now, but join us soon for more from Gary.
The Athletic.